Thanks. Good morning, everybody. Don't know if anybody else does the New York Times crossword, but Monday and Tuesday this week both featured Charles Dickens themed clues. Not today, but the one on Monday was actually title of this book. So helps to know your Dickens. It's Nobel week. So we will have a new laureate by the end of the week. I did look at the bookmakers' odds. There's a lot of names I do not recognize from around the globe, but for local interest, Don DeLillo and Margaret Atwood are both given pretty good odds. So we will see. I also wanted to mention, for those of you who took my class on British murder mysteries, I know a lot of you, like I do, like the author Anne Cleeves and her character Vera Stanhope. There is a new Vera Stanhope book out right now. I think it came out last month. I just downloaded it onto my Kindle, have not read it yet, but it's called The Darkest Evening, Anne Cleeves, and again, a new one in the Vera Stanhope series. What else did I want to mention? New classes. I have just sent in proposals for spring. I think we will still be online. So for those of you who didn't know, I'm doing Madame Bovary in winter. I am going to read the Lydia Davis translation. You can feel free to have whatever translation you want, but that's the one I will be doing. In spring, I just sent in 2 proposals. The first one is for sort of a Victorian literature survey class in response to comments I've had about this class, and getting some more sort of social history and information about the Victorian era out there. There'll be no advanced reading for that class. I will provide excerpts which will come to you through your email, but they will just be excerpts. And a lot of the class will be talking about how the Victorians really lived and examples from not just Dickens, but Trollope and Eliot and the Brontes and Mrs. Gaskell and loads of other authors. So it will be a bit of a mix of social history and literature. And the other, so that's not a lot of advanced reading, but the other class I'm going to do in summer, no, I'm sorry, spring, I mustn't misspeak. Spring 2021 is going to be Victorian Society and Literature, and the other class is going to be Anna Karenina. So we will read one major book together, and the other class will be more, as I say, sort of a survey with information about Victorian literature as well. So I hope those sound appealing, and you'll all join me. Madame Bovary in winter, Anna Karenina, and Victorian Society and Literature in spring. Okay, a reminder that we do not have class next week. There was a special event. I think this class was kind of shoehorned in at the last minute, so no class next week. This week I asked you to read to the end of chapter 25. We will not see each other next Wednesday, but the Wednesday afterwards, the 21st of October, chapters 26 to 35. Before I get into the chapters and go through the story as today, I wanted to say a little bit about women, because we get a better glimpse here of Nancy. And, you know, of course, in the musical, the movie musical, Nancy features quite prominently, probably a bit more so than she does in the book. We are told she's called a girl, and we don't know really how old she is. The age of consent for women in 1840 was 12, which is horrendous and shocking to our modern sensibilities. In 1875, the age of consent was raised to 13. And in 1885, it was raised to 16. So at the time that Dickens was writing this book, the age of consent for women was 12 years of age, which is mind-boggling. Of course, there's never been on the statute books in the UK an age of consent for men for heterosexual sex. Of course not. Why would there be? So we don't quite know how old Nancy is. She's described as a girl. Dickens can't come out and outright say in the book that she's a prostitute. But we are meant, I think, to infer that from the way Fagin and Sykes talk to her and talk about her. In that section we'll read where she's trying to defend Oliver a little bit. The Victorians had this kind of like weird fascination for prostitution, although I suppose it's not that weird when you think about the fact that, you know, women's sexuality particularly was very repressed during this era. You know, women were supposed to be covered from head to toe. They were supposed to be chaste. They were supposed to be, you know, modest human beings. I mean, towards the end of this century, you know, the fad got for sort of Victorian decorum went so crazy that people even covered piano legs so that, you know, they wouldn't have bare legs in the house, which is... So prostitution, I think, is the other side of that. You have, you know, the model of the decent wife, mother, you know, wholly respectable, and then the sort of the side of sexuality, this kind of repressed nature of prostitution, this secret nature. It's hard to get estimates for how many prostitutes there were. I think it was David Cannadine or Judith Flanders again, who talked about the fact that, you know, when you think about who prostitutes were, the Victorian definition was hugely, you know, more inflated than our definition of a prostitute. So, you know, a woman, excuse me, living with a man where they were not married, in some cases, if she was relying on him to you know, feed and clothe her, a kept woman, as we would say, she was sometimes regarded as a prostitute. That would never, you know, we couldn't even begin to count that kind of person as a prostitute in today's sort of language. And again, it very much depended on class, because if you remember when we did Middlemarch and I talked about George Eliot's lover was unable to get a divorce from his first wife, but George, who was Marianne Evans, and Marianne Evans and her lover lived together as husband and wife, and it was kind of, you know, okay in open society. Dickens himself left his wife for a younger woman, and although they were careful not to you know, do anything sort of so overt that people could point to them, it was kind of like a, you know, a known secret. So it was kind of one rule for the rich and one rule for the poor, not surprising there. But the Victorian definition of prostitute, you know, was huge, and it encountered a, you know, a whole raft of people we wouldn't think about, you know, including women who had sex outside of marriage for pleasure. Even if it wasn't sort of the way they earned their living, they would still be lumped in with that definition of prostitute, which is not how we would think about it. So it's hard to know when you're looking at contemporary numbers of prostitutes, whether they really were or whether they were just women living outside the conventions of the day. But certainly there were a lot of prostitutes, and a lot of it was because of, you know, the poverty, the lack of any kind of social, you know, structure to help them. We talked in the very first class about the poor law and what that did to people. People were reluctant to go to the workhouse because it was so god awful. And, you know, for a lot of women, one way that they could earn enough to stay out of the workhouse was through sex. And they were usually very young. There's loads of tales in Victorian history books about, excuse me, women who started out as prostitutes very young and saved their money and then turned that into some sort of respectable living once they got past the age of 30. You know, there was one tale I read of a woman who'd done this, and she became the owner of a very respectable coffee shop, you know, after she'd saved up all her money. So, you know, it was also very difficult for women to do anything in terms of, you know, earning a living outside of the few menial jobs that were allowed to them. They didn't have, you know, the same kind of freedoms as men. A lot of prostitutes earned, you know, as much in a week as a serving girl would earn in a month or more, and would be a lot freer and have, you know, their own sort of sense of destiny about it. So for a lot of people, it wasn't a terrible choice, or at least not the worst choice that they could imagine. I see we've got a couple of questions, so I will pause there for a second. Oh, okay. So Nancy asked, which version of Madame Bovary did you say you would use? It is the Lydia, I'm going to read the Lydia Davis translation. And I can send you the link, Nancy, if you want to email me, if you can't find it. You can use any translation, because I think, you know, some people, I don't want to have people go out and buy a book that when they've already got a copy somewhere else. And sometimes when you do translation classes, it's kind of interesting to have, you know, a different version, because the way authors do translations can sometimes be illuminating. But I'm going to be using Lydia Davis. And Glenn, I notice your point, and we will get there, absolutely. So prostitutes in Victorian London, if we think about, you know, the very strict definition, this is the streetwalker type. Nancy in this book doesn't really fit that. She seems to be more of Bill Sykes's kept woman, although we wouldn't see if she was a streetwalker, because Dickens would not write about that. And by the way, Dickens did kind of pound the pavement himself to see the conditions of the poor people in London, and he did fund a sort of a sanctuary house for fallen women, and he did put a lot of his own money into helping, you know, the women he saw on the street. So he did put his money where his mouth was, as it were. So if we stick to sort of the streetwalkers, it doesn't seem that Nancy was that, although again, as I say, Dickens wouldn't be able to write about Nancy if she was that way. But a lot of them dressed in sort of brightly colored clothes. At the time, the term gay actually meant a prostitute in the 1850s or 1840s, because of the bright colored clothes they often wore. So although it translated into something else in 1840, to call somebody a gay woman meant to call them a prostitute. Language is a fascinating thing, and it changes and transmutes as necessary. One of the big things that would be not noticeable to modern eyes is that women who didn't wear a bonnet or a hat outdoors might be a prostitute. Covering the hair, this is a thing in you know, religious conservatism too, that Orthodox Jews have their women wear wigs, and conservative Islamists have women cover up. So covering a woman's hair is key. So, you know, in Victorian times, if you went out without a bonnet, you could be, you know, people would wonder if you were a prostitute. There was one account I came across in a history book of, you know, a man sort of not accosting, but asking a woman, you know, sort of how much, because she was holding up her skirts so that he could see even above the ankles. And she was horrified because she was not a prostitute. And the streets were, as we read in this section, covered in muck. So signals could be very misleading, but, you know, women who held their skirts up high might be considered prostitutes. It's kind of like a minefield for us these days to think about the social signals that you could have given off unknowingly or unwittingly. So Nancy, we think, is probably not our definition of a prostitute. Oh, and by the way, I wanted to say one more thing about the George Eliot thing and the idea that a woman, because Nancy, it seems to be, is, as I say, Bill Sykes kept a woman in this. So the Victorians would have immediately identified her as a prostitute. I'm not sure that we necessarily would. I mean, we don't know what she does in her off hours, it's hinted, but the historian Ruth Goodman points out that, as I say, Mary Ann Evans, who was living with George Lewes, that's where Mary Ann Evans got her name from. She called herself George Eliot for George, and she lived with him because he couldn't get a divorce from his first wife. They were not the only ones who had difficulties obtaining divorces. Divorces were very hard to obtain. They were very incredibly expensive, just really very difficult. So a lot of people found themselves in that position. And Goodman goes on to point out the difficulty in obtaining a divorce, or the complexity of the incest laws, where a man could marry his own first cousin, but not his dead wife's sister or even his wife's aunt, forced a number of otherwise respectable couples into unions unsanctioned by law. The Victorian incest law was based upon biblical affinity rather than genetic considerations. Genetics was still an unknown science. Charles Darwin himself married his cousin. Meanwhile, the church held that upon marriage, a man and wife became literally one flesh. Thus, a wife's sister was viewed to be the same as one's own sister. For many Victorian families who had to contend with the death of a young wife, marriage of the widower to her sister seemed an ideal solution. She would be naturally inclined to love her dead sister's children and would not be a stranger entering the family home. But it was not allowed under Victorian law, and a lot of people went abroad to marry so that they could be respectable and skirt these incest laws. And yet, you know, as I say, you could go off and marry your own first cousin. But and the other point I wanted to make about women in this time is, if you were, for the time we're writing about, it did get repealed in the later century, and I think sometime in the 1880s. There were these Contagious Diseases Acts. And particularly if you were in a garrison town where there were military soldiers and sailors, if you were considered to be a prostitute, you could be dragged off the streets and incarcerated for anything from 6 days to 6 months, with forced examinations and medical treatment, because you were suspected of carrying sexually transmitted diseases to the military. So women had very few rights. They could be, just, trying to eke out their own living and end up being basically imprisoned at the whim of whoever was the local authority, and be forced into this sort of locked hospital where they were forced to have examinations against their will and forced to have medical treatment against their will. Pretty horrific. And so a lot of it was, this is why women were largely afraid of the label and being labeled as a prostitute or a street woman. I'm going to pause in 1 second and before we go into the book and take questions, but I also want to remind you that when we read these chapters about particularly Nancy and Fagin, and we'll talk more towards the end of the book about the anti-Semitism and the way Fagin and other Jewish people are depicted in the book, we are I think, kind of horrified at the way that Fagin is described. I mean, he's really described as hideous, and you know, he's a thief who lives outside of common society, but he's not as bad as Bill Sikes, and yet he is somehow made monster in this book because of his religion. That would not have struck Dickens readers the same way at all. A lot of them would have, you know, sort of gone, well, yeah, of course. So bear that in mind. But that point is even more relevant in Nancy's case. We see in this part of the book where Nancy sort of steps in to defend Oliver and help him a little bit. And she knows, we see how smart she is, and we know that she knows that Oliver wants to escape, and that, you know, it will be the death of her if he does. She tells him that, you know, every sort of step you take away from me is a blow to me, or something. We are already sympathetic to Nancy because she's a young girl, and we know that she's in this life of crime, prostitution, whatever, probably through no fault of her own, probably through just circumstances, you know, act of birth. Like Oliver, she may have been an orphan, and she's just trying to do her best. Dickens readers would have started by thinking that Nancy had to be a terrible character because she was a low woman of no morals, and they would not have been sympathetic to her from the beginning. So while we're not surprised that she jumps in to defend Oliver, and she seems to have a kind heart, Dickens readers would have been very surprised. They would not have expected somebody of that, sort of, I don't even know if it was her occupation, but somebody in that position who they would have regarded as somebody with no morals and no feeling and no goodness about them. It would have been a shock to see Nancy behave that way. So I think that's worth thinking about too. We come at this with a very 21st century attitude towards these characters. Dickens readers are a different mindset, and they would have seen things in a very different way. So you should bear that in mind. And I think, you know, because of Dickens pounding the pavements at night and seeing these women and realizing how they came to be in this position and why they were doing what they were doing, he had a lot more sympathy and empathy for them, perhaps, than the average Victorian. And so part of his job in his novels is to give these people some humanity and show his readers that a lot of it is there, but for the grace of God go I, kind of thing. Now, he had to be very careful and skirted the language quite a bit, as we'll see when we go through the book. But, you know, he's telling his readers, you think this woman is, you know, a horrible, dirty, low-down scoundrel, and you'd be surprised. So I just want you to bear that in mind. I'm going to pause if there are any questions, and then we'll start into the book. Karen asks, would you say that despite Nancy's lifestyle, she's one of the noblest characters in the story? Yes, I think so. I think, you know, a lot of the women actually, well, some of the women come out kind of well. I think the, you know, we have the Brownlow's housekeeper at the beginning of the book. She's the only one who will not believe that Oliver was really bad. Even Mr. Brownlow begins to wonder if Oliver really was a scoundrel who stole his money. She holds fast the idea that she knows Oliver and she knows that that's not true. Nancy is particularly noble given her circumstances and her youth. I think that she, the way she defends Oliver and tries to help him is remarkable. And she's obviously very, very smart. She picks up, Fagin mentions how smart she is. And of course, Jews were supposed to be very smart and cunning. So for Fagin to take notice of Nancy's intelligence, I think is another little hint. And then, you know, Oliver's mother, who walked with her feet bleeding and no shoes left on her feet, to at least give birth where somebody would bring the child up. You know, a lot of the women come out kind of well in this. I can't think at the moment of any particularly noble man. Mr. Brownlow has a good heart, but, you know, the minute Oliver, and we'll start with this in a minute, takes off with the £5 note in the books, Mr. Brownlow is ready to be persuaded that he was really bad after all. So with that, if you have more questions, keep typing them in. And Donna says, how old do you think Fagin is? That's a good question, because if you look at the illustrations, I've shown you this one before, he could be anything from sort of like 35 to 120, but I'm not sure. I'd be interested if anybody else has a guess. My guess is he's probably in his 40s. Looks a lot older perhaps than he is, and that might be partly the life that he lives. But I think he's quite, he talks about putting stuff by for his old age. Old age was sort of a bit of a different concept then. Nowadays, we don't think of 60 as being old at all, but I think in Dickens' time they would have done. So I think Fagin's some way short of that, just a guess. Okay, so we begin this section with poor Oliver has been recaptured, as it were. Chapter 16, and taken back to Fagin and Bill Sykes. And we get this beginning where he's sort of taken back in, and Charlie Bates and the Artful Dodger are, laughing and joking that he's been taken back. We find out that Fagin had some sense of where Oliver had gone, because if you remember, when Oliver gets taken in by the Brownlows, or Mr. Brownlow, I should say, his housekeeper gives him some new clothes, and she sells his old clothes. And most of the clothing dealers in London at that time were Jews. And Oliver ends up back with his old clothes back on. And there's kind of like a little not so nice insinuation there that, the Jewish network is part of the reason that Oliver is able to be caught again, that somehow, that it's less than honest, it's less than above board, and there's something a bit seamy about the whole thing. So Sykes, of course, manages to get the £5 note, and poor Oliver is back there again. The interesting thing about this is that, we know that Oliver has been brought up by, he was in the workhouse for a while, then he was Mrs. Mann, and back at the workhouse, and back with the undertaker, Sowerberry. And throughout all this, Oliver has maintained a remarkably Christian attitude for somebody who's not brought up around Christians. He's a very pure of heart little boy. He doesn't want to steal. We might begin to speculate where he learned all this from, although that's sort of useless, because in a sense, he has to be this way to be the center of the book. Dickens can't have a protagonist who's not, in some way a good person. If you think about when we read Great Expectations, Pip as a young boy often did and said things, particularly to Joe, that he regretted later. But the fact that he regretted them later shows us that Pip had a heart and soul and conscience, and he was able to learn and absorb the sort of good, Christian lessons that he should have done. We get to Sidney Carton, who's in Tale of Two Cities, who, is sort of dissolute drunk. But at the end of the day, Sidney Carton does the right thing. Oliver has to be a good boy, otherwise, his audience would not have rooted for him and wanted him to succeed. But it is a little bit, not concerning, but I guess you kind of think, where did he pick up all this Christian morality? I think it's enough to sort of say that, it has to be so for the sake of the book. But so we get little breaks in this section where we go back to Mr. Bumble. This is another one of those departures. Mr. Bumble goes to see Mrs. Mann and tells her that he has to go to London on some parochial business, ma'am. We get the, if you remember when Oliver fled, he saw this young child, Dick, at the gates of Mrs. Mann. We just see, again, we get a little portrait here of, to get the audience to realize just how appalling these children were treated. Dick has told Oliver when he was fleeing, Dick said, I'm dying. I'm not going to live very much longer. And he's dragged before Mr. Bumble at Mrs. Mann's house. The child was pale and thin. His cheeks were sunken and his eyes large and bright. The scanty parish dress, the livery of his misery, hung loosely on his feeble body, and his young limbs had wasted away like those of an old man. Such was the little being who stood trembling beneath Mr. Bumble's glance, not daring to lift his eyes from the floor, and dreading even to hear the beadle's voice. "Can't you look at the gentleman, you obstinate boy?" said Mrs. Mann. "What's the matter with you, parochial Dick?" inquired Mr. Bumble. Mrs. Mann goes and says, "Of course there's nothing wrong with you. You have everything you want. We know the child is dying. This is, horrendous on a unimaginable level for a lot of people." And but it's crucial that Dick is brought before him, because he lets Mr. Bumble know that he fled to London. We get this also, there's a certain saccharine quality to sort of little bits of Dickens writing, and this is one here where Dick says to Mr. Bumble, "I should like," said the child, "to leave my dear love to poor Oliver Twist, and to let him know how often I've sat by myself and cried to think of his wandering about in the dark nights with nobody to help him. And I should like to tell him," said the child, pressing his small hands together and speaking with great fervour, "that I was glad to die when I was very young, for perhaps if I'd lived to be a man and had grown old, my little sister who's in heaven might forget me or be unlike me, and it would be so much happier if we were both children there together." Well, it's a bit saccharine here, but we get the picture. Poor Dick is dying, and but I think, there must have been many sort of Victorian reader who, dabbed a handkerchief to his or her eye at that part, and realized how lucky they were to have their own children safe and warm in a middle-class home. But this is a plot device to get us to Mr. Bumble meeting Mr. Brownlow. Mr. Brownlow has put an advertisement in the newspaper offering 5 guineas reward. A guinea was £1 and a shilling. And I told you last time that the purchasing power of 5 guineas is close to about 400 and odd pounds now. So it's a big reward. This was not a trivial amount. So Mr. Bumble sees this and he goes to see Mr. Brownlow. And of course, we've got Mr. Grimwig there, who's sort of featuring like a Greek chorus on this to push Mr. Brownlow further and further into this idea that Oliver really was a scoundrel and did steal his money and his books. And, you know, he gives, Mr. Bumble takes the 5 guineas reward and off he goes, having told Mr. Brownlow really nothing more than he's, you know, a scoundrel. He's, we all thought he was going to be hanged. And of course he stole your money. Of course he stole your books. Why are you even thinking about this? So again, think about it from the point of view of, you know, Dickens readers. They're going to be outraged on Oliver's behalf at this. You know, this good little boy who didn't want to steal anything and still doesn't want to steal anything is being impugned by Mr. Bumble even long after he's out of the workhouse. But, you know, back to when Karen raised the point about Nancy being noble, Mrs. Bedwin stands by him towards the end, the very end of this chapter, chapter 17. Mr. Grimwig's saying, yeah, I knew it. I told him. I knew it all along. And Mrs. Bedwin defends him and says, he was a dear, grateful, gentle child, sir. I know what children are, sir, and have done these 40 years. And people who can't say the same shouldn't say anything about them. That's my opinion. This was a hard hit at Mr. Grimwig, who was a bachelor. As it extorted nothing from that gentleman but a smile, the old lady tossed her head and smoothed down her apron preparatory to another speech when she was stopped by Mr. Brownlow. And Mr. Brownlow, I think, you know, is incredibly unwilling to believe that Oliver has really stolen his money, but faced with this evidence, he really has no choice. And it saddens him greatly, probably less because he's lost the money more than that, you know, he felt like he'd been deceived by Oliver. Of course, we know the truth. But Mrs. Bedwin is told never to mention his name again. I'm going to pause there and see if there are any more questions. Warm gin and water. I'm just kidding. It's just water. There's a lot of warm gin and water in this book. I like my gin nice and cold. Lots of ice, tonic water, slice of lemon. G&T, ice and a slice. So the next chapter, you know, we find Oliver back in Fagin's grasp, alone, no friends, locked up for huge parts of the day. I think Dickens here is trying to say that, you know, even the very best of people, when faced with these kind of circumstances, even good kids can go bad. And I think he's trying to give his readers a little lesson in this because, you know, poor Oliver is left by himself reading this blood-curdling book about nasty crimes that have been committed, completely isolated. It's like he's in solitary confinement. And he's, only when the Dodger says to him, come and clean my boots, does Oliver willingly say, sure, because it's the first chance he's had for some human contact. So, as I said, we might start out thinking that, you know, Nancy deserves the life she's in, and the Artful Dodger and Charlie Bates are terrible people. I think Dickens is trying to say to us, if you left in the company and sort of levels of, you know, with desperation about how you're going to make your way in the world, this is how people get caught up in this lifestyle. So, you know, we have this whole chapter where Dodger and Charlie Bates are really trying to entice Oliver into becoming a thief, and saying, you know, you're going to do it sooner or later. Why wouldn't you just do it sooner and just, you know, commit to the life? Dodger has, you know, money in his hands, saying, look, you know, I've got this money and there's more where it came from. And, you know, Dodger says, make your fortune. Oliver is still, you know, implacably trying to resist and say, no, you know, this is not what I want. And Oliver is still trying to think about how he can escape. Okay, so. Paulette asked, would kids from the workhouse have been taught to read? Yes, they had schools in workhouses. I mean, they were fairly rudimentary, but I think that's where we can imagine that Oliver learned to read. They did, when families got put into the workhouse, they were separated. They kind of had three wings, one for the women, one for the men, one for the children. And they did have schools in the workhouse. So I think it's entirely plausible that Oliver can read quite well. They were given all these sort of improving books on, you know, being a good boy or girl. So maybe that's where Oliver also got his sort of sense of morality from. So we're up to chapter 19. The Jew. He's still regarded a lot as the Jew. Sykes is Sykes, Nancy is Nancy, but Fagin is more often than not called the Jew. Sykes and Fagin are discussing a house outside of Chertsey, and the plan is to go and rob it. And they Fagin talks about the amount of plate there. He means silver plate, and you know, other valuable items. And he says there's no way in, and he goes to the lengths that they have got. They've tried to bribe their servants. This is an old lady apparently who lives there. They've tried to bribe the servants to sort of leave a door open. The servants are loyal. They're not going to do this. And, you know, they've got dogs and everything. And eventually they realize there's one bit that they can get into, but it's a small lattice window inside another door. When Fagin says it's a panel, that's a small door set into a larger door. And they need a small boy to go through there. So who's the smallest, least fed boy we can think of right now? Well, it's Oliver. So Fagin says, all right, well, you know, get Nancy to sort of pick him up and he can go do this. And this is when we get the oh no, that's earlier when Nancy's defended him, but Fagin is now wondering if he can trust Nancy given that she defended Oliver before. But he looks intently at her and he thinks that she's kind of sold on this plan and she's not going to do anything that's going to put them in trouble. Remember, the fear was that Oliver would, you know, talk to the police and tell them where Fagin's gang were hiding out, that he would squeal, basically. We learn in this section that it seems like Toby Crackett, not Toby Crackett, I'm sorry, I'm getting mixed up with Mr. Chitling, who's sweet on Betsy, that he ended up going to prison, walked on the treadmill, rather than give Betsy up to the police. We learn he's very sweet on Betsy. So squealing and turning your friends in was huge. Although Oliver points out when he's cleaning the Dodger's boots that, you know, the Dodger and Charlie Bates ran off and let Oliver take the blame for stealing from Mr. Brownlow. So there's only a certain amount of honor amongst thieves to be had. So Oliver's given some nice strong shoes and he's left alone for a while, and then Nancy comes to pick him up and take him to Bill Sykes. And we get these long periods of time where Nancy's gazing into the fire and not speaking. And this happens again after Bill Sykes takes Oliver off to Chertsey when they leave Bill Sykes' lodgings. And so I think we can understand that this is where Nancy is turning over in her head the morality and what she's doing and what she is possibly going to get poor Oliver into. And she says that, Oliver looks at her and tries to play upon her compassion because he knows she has some, to let him go. And this is where Nancy says, I can't do this. This is chapter 20. Nancy says to him, I have saved you from being ill-used once, and I will again, and I do now, continued the girl aloud. For those who would have fetched you, if I had not, would have been far more rough than me. I have promised for your being quiet and silent. If you are not, you will only do harm to yourself and me too, and perhaps be my death. See here, I have borne all this for you already, as true as God sees me show it. She pointed hastily to some livid bruises on her neck and arms, and continued with great rapidity, remember this, and don't let me suffer more for you just now. If I could help you, I would, but I have not the power. They don't mean to harm you, and whatever they make you do is no fault of yours. Hush. Every word from you is a blow for me. Give me your hand. Make haste, your hand. So she's absolving him from any blame in this enterprise. I think that's very important from the point of view of, Oliver's character and his morality. He's a very little boy, and he really has, no physical power, certainly, and certainly no sort of moral sway with Bill Sikes or anybody else to do anything about this. And Nancy's basically saying, this is how you stay alive. Just, don't do anything crazy. This is how you stay alive. And this is also how Nancy stays alive too, because, Sikes is going to take it out on Nancy if Oliver escapes again. She takes him back to Bill Sikes's house. They feed him. They give him a dish of sheep's heads, which, I know people ate everything and were grateful for food, but I have a note in the book here that I didn't know that sheep's heads were called jemmies. That was a nickname. But a jemmy was also a crowbar that a thief used to jemmy open a door. So Bill Sikes is very pleased with himself about this coincidence of the dish that Nancy puts before him. Of course, everything is, calculated to remind us of what they're going to do. Oliver still doesn't know this, but we do. We know that they're going to put Oliver through this little window and get him to open up the house. So we have poor Oliver dragged out of bed in the morning. I have a note in my book here about how far they walk before they get into a cart. They walk through the city, and you can recreate this walk. These streets still exist. You can walk this way today. It's like 7 o'clock in the morning, I think. And they start off in the East End. Bethnal Green is northeast of London. So Oliver and Sikes walk southwest from Bethnal Green into the central London business district, the city. That's the square mile that used to have the Roman wall around it, the original city of London. Westward to the cattle market at Smithfield, and then through Holborn and Hyde Park. Holborn, as it's written in the book, is Holborn, pronounced Holborn, and Hyde Park Corner to the West End. At Kensington, they hitch a ride that takes them through Hammersmith to Isleworth. From there, they walk and ride westward to the village of Hampton and Hampton Court, which is where Henry VIII had his sort of country house. And then to the country villages of Sunbury, Upper Halliford, Shepperton and Chertsey, near the Thames in Surrey, a total distance of about 28 miles from Bethnal Green. So they walk quite a long way of this. I think I told you this, that Dickens himself would walk for miles and miles every day, and think nothing of walking 20 miles in a day. I think it's a very different matter for poor young Oliver, who's underfed, undernourished, and is struggling very much to keep up with Bill Sikes. They get a ride on a cart, and the cart driver is kind to Oliver, and Bill's kind of like, don't, he's a dog, don't pay any attention to him. They go into a pub and waste some time, kill some time, I guess, eating and drinking, and by dint of Bill buying somebody else a drink, they get another ride as far out as the Sunbury church, where the clock strikes 7. So they've been on the road since 7 in the morning till 7 at night. And they get taken to this house. This is not the house they're going to rob, but where Toby Crackit is there with Barney. Crackit, of course, is another one of those Dickensian names that lets us know what his purpose in life is. A thief was often called a cracksman, and he's gonna, Toby's gonna crack it. So poor, Oliver is taken into this grim, horrible place, and the door is opened to them by this character Barney. Again, there's a little anti-Semitic slur here, because he talks through his nose. Nose is apparently being fairly prominent features in anti-Semitism, and he says, "Mr. Sikes, kabid, sir, kabid." They proceed over to this house in Chertsey. They've got guns, plenty of guns. Sikes partly gets Oliver to go with him and not try and run away, with the notion that he's going to shoot him if he tries to run away from him. And Oliver sees the pistol, and he is absolutely terrified of this. And they load up some more pistols. They've got pistols and cudgels. And so plenty of guns, which is kind of been more surprising now in British novel than it was back then. But they get to this house. They do hear that Barney has managed to get the dog lured away. Barney enticed away the dog, perhaps just offered the dog some meat and got him locked up. So that there should be nothing to stop Oliver getting in through the window and going to the front door to let in Bill and Toby Crackit. And they're giving Oliver all these instructions. And Oliver is, the only thought in Oliver's mind, this is the very end of chapter 22. Take this lantern, said Sikes, looking into the room. You see the stairs are for you? Oliver, more dead than alive, gasped out, yes. Sikes, pointing to the street door with the pistol barrel, briefly advised him to take notice that he was within shot all the way, and that if he faltered, he would fall dead that instant. It's done in a minute, said Sikes in the same low whisper. Directly I leave go of you, do your work. Hark. What's that? Whispered the other man. They listened intently. Nothing, said Sikes, releasing his hold of Oliver. Now. In the short time he had to collect his senses, the boy had firmly resolved that whether he died in the attempt or not, he would make one effort to dart up the stairs from the hall and alarm the family. Filled with this idea at once, he advanced at once, but stealthily. Come back, suddenly cried Sikes aloud. Back, back! Scared by the sudden breaking of the dead stillness of the place, and by a loud cry which followed it, Oliver let his lantern fall, and knew not whether to advance or fly. The cry was repeated, a light appeared. A vision of two terrified, half-dressed men at the top of the stairs swam before his eyes. A flash, a loud noise, a smoke, a crash somewhere, but where he knew not, and he staggered back. Sykes had disappeared for an instant, but he was up again and had him by the collar before the smoke had cleared away. He fired his own pistol after the men who were already retreating and dragged the boy up. "Clasp your arm tighter," said Sykes as he drew him through the window. "Give me a shawl here. They've hit him. Quick." Damnation, how the boy bleeds. Then came the loud ringing of a bell, mingled with the noise of firearms and the shouts of men, and the sensation of being carried over uneven ground at a rapid pace. And then the noises grew confused in the distance, and a cold, deadly feeling crept over the boy's heart, and he saw or heard no more. So Oliver in critical, mortal peril at this point. And that was, obviously these were weekly installments. You can only imagine getting to the end of that and thinking, oh my God, I can't wait until next week to find out what happens to this poor boy. And then when we get to next week, you find out you're going to have to wait even longer. But I will pause. I see we have a couple of questions. Mary Lou says she loves that he calls the guns barkers. Yes. Yeah, barkers is, we when we get back to Fagin at the end, you will see that Charlie and the Artful Dodger are playing cards, and they have quite a chat in a lot of criminal language, and they kind of have to explain it. And they have to also explain quite a lot to Oliver in that scene where he's cleaning the Dodger's boots. And a lot of that is, of course, that Dickens is directly explaining that to his readership, because if you were, a nice, well-brought-up middle-class family sitting by the fireside reading your installment of Oliver Twist, all these phrases would be, quite new and exciting to you. You wouldn't have been expected to know what everything meant. So having the characters explain them to, they call Oliver the Green, he's green and innocent. And there's a lot of things about the thieving underworld and the criminal world get explained to him, as well as, chat between each other, among the criminals themselves. It's kind of like when we all watched The Godfather and learned what he's sleeping with the fishes or something like that. Things that we wouldn't have been expected to know. Some things like sleeping with the fishes, you can clearly intuit, and some things have to be explained. I would think a lot of people who, knew what a crowbar was called a jemmy might not have actually known that it was also slang for sheep's head. That would be kind of the other way around, because you didn't have to eat that kind of offal. So we are now at chapter 23, and we've left poor Oliver, who's been shot. And, we have a cold, deadly feeling crept over his heart. So the good news is that, if you actually look at the book, we are only approaching about 2/3 of the way through this, maybe half of this. And the book is called Oliver Twist, not Adventures in Criminal Victorian London, or Adventures of Fagin and his gang, or, Mr. Bumble's Further History. So with the title of the book being Oliver Twist, and at least a good third to half of it still left, we can be certain, I think, that Oliver is not dead, but we are not yet allowed to learn out to learn his fate. So everything has been put on hold. So chapter 23, imagine you're back in Dickens' time and you're waiting for the weekly installment, and you run up to the bookseller to get your copy of this magazine, and eagerly open it, hoping to see the words "Oliver woke up in," and we're back with Mr. Bumble. So you still have to wait. So we're talking about Mrs. Corney, who's now the matron of the workhouse. And there is quite a bit of comedy here, although again, it's really tinged with, this overlay of just how horrible these people are, especially to the poor people who basically, are starving and freezing in the workhouse while Mrs. Corney is ladling tea into her teapot and sitting in front of a full fire. She has enough spare food to feed a family of kittens. People didn't have pets if they were poor, because you needed every scrap of food to survive. You couldn't afford to feed it to animals. And although they probably could, scavenge around for mice and things, she may still have been comfortable enough to give the kittens a few scraps. So it's a cold, horrible night, and we see Mrs. Corney making her tea. Corney Barrett, James Comey. It's just in the news. Sorry. Freudian slip. I was watching the Comey report last night. So anyway. Mrs. Corney is making her tea, and Mr. Bumble shows up. Before we get there, I love this little aside from Dickens. We know she's a widow, and Mrs. Corney is looking at her teapot, and the small teapot and the single cup had awakened in her mind sad reflections of Mr. Corney, who'd not been dead more than 25 years, and she was overpowered. I shall never get another like him. Whether this remark bore reference to the husband or the teapot is uncertain. So I do like that very much. Anyway, Mr. Bumble comes in, and we have this lovely comedy of, Mr. Bumble trying to decide whether or not he's going to make a move on Mrs. Corney. And the way they talk about the paupers, he goes on about how he's given out all this bread and cheese today. He says, we've given out 20 quartern loaves. So that's a quarter of a loaf. So they've given out 5 loaves, basically, and a cheese and a half. And yet the paupers are not contented. It's not that much food. Of course not. Why would they be, Mr. Bumble, said the matron, sipping her tea. When indeed, ma'am, rejoined Mr. Bumble, why, here's one man that in consideration of his wife and a large family has a quartern loaf and a good pound of cheese. Is he grateful, ma'am? Is he grateful? No, not a cup of farthing's worth of it. What does he do, ma'am, but ask for a few coals? Only a pocket handkerchief full, he says. Coals? What would he do with coals? Toast his cheese with them and then come back for more. That's the way with these people, ma'am. Give them an apron full of coals today and they'll come back for another the day after tomorrow as brazen as alabaster. We open this chapter with a description of the weather and how cold it is. And we have seen in Chertsey, back when Oliver is going to do this robbery, that his hair and his eyebrows are almost freezing with this mist, the fog. And they're sitting, Bumble and Corney are sitting in front of this nice blazing fire. And, talking about how ungrateful the paupers are and how disgusting it is. So they go on in this pitch for a while. And again, I think it's meant to shock contemporary readers into realizing how, both how lucky they are and really how the poor people are living. And then there's a little remark that says, don't you think of outdoor relief as a very bad thing? Outdoor relief, as I told you, was charity given to the poor that allowed them to stay in their own homes. That meant just taking food and coals, other necessities to their houses, and not having them come and live in the workhouse. And Mr. Bumble replies to this, Mrs. Corney, said the beadle, smiling as men smile who are conscious of superior information. Just want to say right then and there was mansplaining in Dickens' Victorian literature. Mansplaining. He knew what it was. Dickens is saying, I'm slowing down because I'm a man. I'm talking to Mrs. Corney, who's a woman. Mansplaining. Anyway. Out-of-door relief, properly managed, ma'am, is the parochial safeguard. The great principle of outdoor relief is to give the paupers exactly what they don't want, and then they get tired of coming. So we can sort of laugh about this in a way, because he starts off by saying, no, outdoor relief is the way to go. And just when you're getting suckered into thinking, oh, well, he's got some humanity in him after all, he thinks that, actually allowing people to stay in their own homes would be a good thing. He kind of takes a left turn and says, you just give them what they don't want or need, and then they don't even bother asking anymore. So it is kind of funny, but also kind of obviously very sad at the same time. So before we finish this chapter and the next, I will pause, see with a couple of questions. Would readers of installments, Mary Lou asks, would readers of installments have any idea of how many there would be in order? How many were to come? That's a good question. Sometimes they were published that way, and it would say, to be in however many weekly installments. More often, no, they wouldn't know exactly how many were coming, because the writers hadn't finished writing them. And they didn't know themselves. The authors didn't know how many installments it would take to wrap up the story. And Dickens was in a slightly different position, because he owned magazines. And, there's some suggestion that, if he got another submission for his magazine, he might be tempted to wrap up his story a little bit early, because he got something to put in the magazine in its place. And if they had nothing coming in from other authors, that he might be tempted to drag out his story a little bit more, because he had nothing else to put in his magazine. So he's wearing two hats as both publisher and author. Sometimes they were given whole things and they knew in advance how they could divide it up. The interesting thing about this book is when 2/3 of it was published in magazine installments, the book was published, I think, in 3 volumes, and that was incredibly rare. Usually it was not published as a book until after all the magazine installments had been produced. So if you had the money, or you could find a lending library that had a copy of the book and had the money to borrow it. Lending libraries in those days were private and were not free. You could find out the ending before the people who bought the magazine. It's kind of like being able to stream it on Netflix when everybody else is, watching on regular cable. But we get this lovely comedy then, after they've kind of sort of dissed the poor and decided that they're all worthless and how can they not live as good lives as Bumble and Corney do, Mr. Bumble makes as if he's going to leave, and Mrs. Corney knows exactly what's going on. I mean, she's not an idiot. And there's this sort of little dance about, well, should I invite him for another cup of tea or what have you? We find out when he comes in, he says to her, shall I shut the door? And of course, Mrs. Corney wants him to shut the door, but she doesn't want to be the one to say it, because that's not very decorous of a lady to say, yes, come in and shut the door and we'll have a, private meeting behind closed doors. So she hesitates just long enough for Bumble to do it anyway. So she invites him to stay for a cup of tea. So they sit down, and we're left with this comedy. I'm trying to wonder if there's a sexual joke in this section, and I find it hard to think that Dickens would have put this in. She's asking Mr. Bumble how he takes his tea, and she says sweet, and the implication is that she's asking him if he's sweet-natured as well as how he takes his tea, because Mr. Bumbles is very sweet indeed, man. And that's a bit of a clue that, you know, he's sweet-tempered and he's sweet on her, I think. Later on, she calls him a hard-hearted man besides. And hard-hearted man, said Mr. Bumble, hard. And I'm just wondering if he's saying he's still sort of sexually vigorous. I'm not sure. Maybe that's just I'm reading too much about prostitutes in research of this, but I don't know. Make up your own minds. But, you know, they're sitting there and we have this kind of little domestic comedy, and it's a round table in front of the fire. And the fire is so good that, you know, he's able to move away from it. You know, contrast that to the poor man asking for his handful of coals. And, you know, Mr. Bumble is gradually moving his chair around the table until he gets right next to Mrs. Corney. So towards the end of this chapter, whatever were Mr. Bumble's intentions, however, and no doubt they were of the best, it unfortunately happened, as been twice before remarked, that the table was a round one. Consequently, Mr. Bumble, moving his chair by little and little, soon began to diminish the distance between himself and the matron, and continuing to travel round the outer edge of the circle, brought his chair in time close to that in which the matron was seated. Indeed, the two chairs touched, and when they did so, Mr. Bumble stopped. Now, if the matron had moved her chair to the right, she would have been scorched by the fire, and if to the left, she must have fallen into Mr. Bumble's arms. So, being a discreet matron, and no doubt foreseeing these consequences at a glance, she remained where she was. And she hands him another cup of tea. This is like, reminds me of Pip being given all the gravy in the chapter of Great Expectations. The beadle drank his tea to the last drop, finished a piece of toast, whisked the crumbs off his knees, wiped his lips, and deliberately kissed the matron. "Mr. Bumble," cried that discreet lady in a whisper, for the fright was so great that she quite lost her voice. "Mr. Bumble, I shall scream." Mr. Bumble made no reply, but in a slow and dignified manner put his arm around the matron's waist. As the lady had stated her intention of screaming, of course she would have screamed at this additional boldness, but that the exertion was rendered unnecessary by a hasty knocking at the door, which was no sooner heard than Mr. Bumble darted with much agility to the wine bottles and began dusting them with great violence, while the matron sharply demanded who was there. And who is there, as somebody tell her that poor old Sally is dying and the matron's supposed to be there when anybody dies. And we know from Mrs. Corney's protestations about screaming and Mr. Bumble, please don't, that she's actually knowing exactly what's going on. And she's really ticked off that she has to, leave this comfy fireside with this lovely Mr. Beadle who's, kissing her and squeezing her, and she's got to go and see poor Sally. At this intelligence, the worthy Mrs. Corney, of course, ironic, she's got absolutely no worth whatsoever, muttered a variety of invectives against old women who couldn't even die without purposely annoying their betters. She requests Mr. Bumble to stay until she came back, lest anything particular should occur. Please don't go. We can pick this up where we left off when I get back, kind of thing. And then the nicest, I think the best comedy of all is that last paragraph in this chapter 24. Mr. Bumble's conduct, chapter 23, I'm sorry. Mr. Bumble's conduct on being left to himself was rather inexplicable. He opened the closet, counted the teaspoons, weighed the sugar tongs, closely inspected a silver milk pot to ascertain that it was of the genuine metal, and having satisfied his curiosity on these points, put on his cocked hat cornerwise and danced with much gravity 4 distinct times round the table. Having gone through this very extraordinary performance, he took off the cocked hat again, and spreading himself before the fire with his back towards it, seemed to be mentally engaged in taking an exact inventory of the furniture. So he is taking an inventory of the furniture. He's weighing up whether or not he should actually propose to Mrs. Corney, whether she's actually got any money worth having. The fact that the silver milk pot is indeed silver and the sugar tongs seem heavy enough seem to put him in a very good mood. So I will pause there 1 second. Steph says, mansplaining and gaslighting is nothing new. Gaslighting seems perfectly named for Dickens. He seems to be very sympathetic to women, hopefully opening readers' eyes. I think he was. I think he was genuinely incredibly sympathetic to women. And I think he was, as I say, he did, fund a house for fallen women. I was mansplained to myself not that long ago by somebody from Fairfax County. And so I actually had some sympathy with Mrs. Corney just for a second there, but it didn't last very long. So poor Mrs. Corney has been had her, comfortable evening by the fire interrupted. We still, as a weekly reader, are not able to find out what happened to Oliver. We're being made to wait at least another week. And then she's told, poor Sally's dying. And the pharmacist is there, the apothecary he's called, I think. And he's in a room with a dying woman, and all he's concerned about is making a toothpick out of a quill, out of a feather, and putting that to good use. So nobody really cares. It's kind of a matter of form that they've called Mrs. Corney to see old Sally die. To Glenn's point, he asked me to explain this. It's all UP there, Mrs. Corney. He's just spelling the word up. It's all up. It's all over. And I think from that, he's just assuming that poor old Sally can't read or write, which is possibly very true. But just it's saying it's all up. It's all over. It's all UP. And we see these two horrible women who are supposedly taking care of poor old Sally. They're talking about this dying woman. Did she drink the hot wine the doctor said she was to have, demanded the first. I tried to get it down, rejoined the other, but her teeth were tight set and she clenched the mug so hard that it was as much as I could do to get it back again. So I drank it and it did me good. Horrible, horrible people in care of this poor dying old woman. So they leave her alone with Mrs. Corney, and Mrs. Corney, they say she's got something she wants to tell you. And Mrs. Corney gets close and she's sort of waiting there for Sally to say something. And just before she dies, she said, Sally tells her, she said, I stole it. Stole what, for God's sake, cried the matron. It, replied the woman, laying her hand over the other's mouth, the only thing she had. She wanted clothes to keep her warm and food to eat, but she kept it safe and had it in her bosom. It was gold, I tell you, rich gold that might have saved her life. So we know she's talking about a locket or a chain or something, some piece of jewelry. She says, she charged me to keep it safe, replied the woman. She trusted me as the only woman about her. I stole it in my heart when she first showed it me hanging around her neck, and the child's death perhaps is on me besides. They would have treated him better if they'd known it all, i.e. they would have treated this child better if they knew he had some money. And then she tells us, the poor child, he was a gentle lamb like his mother. And Mrs. Corney is standing there saying, well, who was this child? And then we hear they called him Oliver. And poor old Sally says, the gold I stole was, that's on me, hear the beep, 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 beep. She was bending eagerly over the woman to hear her reply, but drew back instinctively as she once again rose slowly and stiffly into a sitting posture. Then, clutching the coverlet with both hands, muttered some indistinct sounds in her throat and fell lifeless on the bed. "Stone dead," said one of the old women, hurrying in as soon as the door was opened. "And nothing to tell after all," said the matron, walking away. So she has been told something. She knows something very significant. And we are now also aware that there's something very significant about Oliver, some clue to his identity that still exists. And we're still in the dark as to what happened to poor Oliver, and we are still in the dark as to exactly what the nature of this gold jewelry is, and whether it will eventually come to let Oliver either know some prosperity or identify some family members. So we're on to chapter 25, and we still don't find out what fully happened to Oliver. But we have a sense here again that, Dickens is trying to show us that at least Fagin does have some semblance of a conscience, because Fagin is gazing into the fire and very thoughtful and seemingly sort of lost, while Charlie and Dodger are playing whist. And we're led to believe that either Dodger can see Mr. Chitling's cards, or he's marked the cards somehow, because he's very focused on the cards Chitling has in his hand. And the Dodger wins every round of this whist, every rubber, and Chitling is bewildered as why, no matter what cards he has, the Dodger always seems to win. So the implication strongly there is, of course, that either he can somehow see Chitling's cards, maybe in the mirror, in the window behind him, or he's just marked them in some way. And we get this chapter again. This is where we find out that Tom has been in prison, and he went to prison rather than squeal on Betsy. And we're just kind of wondering where this other little domestic scene is going to go. We've had Mr. Bumble and Mrs. Corney round the fire, and now we have Fagin and the boys, and all of a sudden Barney comes in and says, I'm sorry, not Barney, Toby Crackit comes in, and he, says, I've got to tell you something, but before I do, you better make sure I've got some food and drink. And so Fagin first asks about, Toby Crackit says to Fagin, "How's Bill?" And Fagin jumps from his seat, and he hasn't seen Bill, he doesn't know, and Toby doesn't know. So obviously they all split up after the robbery. And Fagin is very upset. We don't know whether he's upset about Bill or the boy, because Fagin says, "Where are they? Sykes and the boy, where are they? Where have they been? Where are they hiding? Why have they not been here?" The crack failed, Toby says. That means the robbery failed. And it's been in the newspaper. Fagin says, "Yeah, I know, and he says, what else happened?" So Toby carries on. "They fired and hit the boy. We cut over the fields at the back with him between us, straight as the crow flies through the hedge and ditch. They gave chase. Damn me," obviously Dickens couldn't put it in. "The whole country was awake and the dogs upon us." "The boy," gasped the Jew. "Bill had him on his back and scudded like the wind. We stopped to take him between us. His head hung down and he was cold. They were close upon our heels, every man for himself, and each from the gallows. We parted company and left the youngster lying in a ditch. Alive or dead, that's all I know about him." This Jew stopped to hear no more, but uttering a loud yell and twining his hands in his hair, rushed from the room and from the house. So I think we can begin to see that even maybe Fagin has got some conscience at this point. So I will leave it there. I have a question here from, I don't know if this is from Charles or Terry. The Beadle, the Workhouse, and how the communities manage the poor. Are there monies coming in from the larger state? No, they didn't. The Parliament passed a bill in 1832. It was known as the Reform Act. And the Reform Act was meant to enfranchise a much larger collection of people. There was a limit on people who could vote. It wasn't just every man could vote. It was property owners, and the property qualification was quite high. In 1832, they lowered the property qualification to be able to vote. And so they enfranchised a whole sort of, vast numbers of middle-class people, men, obviously, who were able to vote. But they had to pay something called rates, which is a property tax. And the property tax came from the middle-class people, and that was used to fund the workhouse and fund the poor. There were several poor laws throughout the century that gradually tried to address the position of the poor, but it wasn't until well into the 20th century that there was any kind of social safety net for people. So the problems persisted, although towards the latter third of the 19th century, there was a recognition that the workhouses were not working, were not appropriate, and they didn't solve anything. And so they had largely gone back to sort of the more of the outdoor relief where charity was given to people in their own homes. There were two avenues to fund that as well. One was this property tax, or called rates, collected from everybody who owned any kind of property, and I mean real property. It wasn't taxed on personal property, but it was taxed on houses, land, all that kind of stuff. It was funded by that, and there was huge charitable efforts, like Dickens himself funding a home for fallen women, and churches had a collection every Sunday. If you went to church, you were supposed to put money in the collection plate, and this money was used for local charitable efforts for the poor. It was not until the 20th century and the beginning of, sort of really after the First World War, that there was even any move towards developing a strong safety net for people. And it was not until the middle of the 20th century when Britain got the National Health Service and things like that. So Donna says, Dodger and Oliver are the same age, yet very different with regard to character and life choices. Was Dickens trying to make a point with the difference in character that not all young people ended up like Dodger? I think so. I think, we talked last week about was there a way out of this? And I think Dickens was largely of the view that, circumstances didn't determine everything, that there are a lot of other factors in play. I think, Dodger has decided that, the only way to live is to sort of join in. And maybe that was true for Dodger. I mean, maybe he just, he has a lot of what we would call street smarts, obviously. The idea that he can make money playing cards with somebody who doesn't realize that, he's cheating is part of his sharpness. And Oliver doesn't seem to have that kind of sharpness, but he has a morality that the Dodger doesn't have. So I think it's a combination of things that, certainly education. Dickens himself was very poor as a kid, but, he's kind of got out of that situation. So I don't think he thinks that circumstances determine everything, but I think he's also very empathetic towards the notion that when you're poor and defenseless, it can be much easier to fall in with the common herd than it can be to sort of strike out and do the right thing. So he was warning of being overly moralistic about this. So thank you for that. We're a little past time. We will not be meeting for this class next week. So I will see you in 2 weeks on the 21st of October. And maybe we'll find out if Oliver Twist is still alive. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Meg.
Thank you, Kay, and I'm going to end this for everyone.